Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The forest was dense and alive, its canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving only patches of pale green illumination on the ground. The hunter moved with practiced precision, each step deliberate and quiet. His rifle hung from his shoulder, and his revolver rested snugly in its holster. This was his domain, a vast unbroken wilderness where he could escape the noise of the world. Yet today the silence unsettled him. Normally the forest thrummed with life, the chatter of birds, the rustling of squirrels, and the occasional distant howl of a wolf. But now the quiet was absolute, oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He paused, scanning the surroundings. The tall pines swayed gently, their trunks marked with clawed gashes that looked too large to be from any animal he knew. The hunter tightened his grip on the rifle's strap. He had been tracking deer, but the usual signs, hoofprints, scat, broken branches, were absent. It was as though the forest's usual inhabitants had fled, leaving him alone in its vastness. A part of him wanted to turn back, but the seasoned outdoorsman in him scoffed at the thought. He was no stranger to eerie moments in the woods, after all. The first sign of something unnatural came when he noticed the light. At first it was just a faint glimmer through the trees, barely visible in the distance. He thought it might be sunlight reflecting off a distant creek or a hunter's lantern, but as he approached, the light grew stronger and steadier. It wasn't flickering like a flame, but rotating, sweeping through the forest in regular intervals. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. Finally the trees thinned, and the hunter emerged into a clearing. His breath caught. Before him stood a towering structure, a lighthouse, its whitewashed walls streaked with age and grime. The lens at the top turned methodically, casting its beam across the forest. It was absurd, impossible. A lighthouse? Here in the heart of the woods? The nearest ocean was hundreds of miles away. The hunter stood frozen, his mind scrambling for explanations. An old art installation? A bizarre forest ranger outpost? But the size and design of the lighthouse were unmistakable. It looked as if it had been plucked from a rocky coastline and dropped here without reason or warning. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the entrance. The wooden door at the base was slightly ajar, creaking faintly as it swung in the breeze. There were no signs of life, no voices, no footsteps, not even the rustle of leaves. The hunter's instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity and the pull of the unknown won out. With a deep breath, he nudged the door open and stepped inside, rifle at the ready. The interior of the lighthouse was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the oppressive stillness of the forest. The hunter's boots echoed softly on the stone floor as he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the small, dirt-streaked windows. The air carried a faint metallic tang, mixed with the musty smell of damp wood and mildew. The room was circular, with a spiral staircase ascending along the walls. Rusted metal and weathered wood formed the steps, which groaned faintly under his weight as he tested the first one. To his left was a small table covered in dust and cobwebs, and beside it, a set of shelves lined with objects too faded to discern at first glance. The hunter knelt down, brushing aside the dust on the table. His fingers brushed against an old oil lamp still half full, and a stack of faded papers weighted down by a rusted key. He glanced upward, following the staircase with his eyes. The faint sound of the light's rotation, an eerie mechanical hum, seemed to reverberate through the structure. He felt a peculiar sense of being watched, though there was no one else there. The door behind him creaked as the wind nudged it slightly ajar, sending a faint draft into the room. His gaze fell on the far corner where a leather-bound journal lay atop a smaller dust-covered desk. The edges of the pages were yellowed and curled, and the cover was embossed with a strange, swirling symbol he didn't recognize. Intrigued, he picked it up. the leather cool and dry beneath his fingers. Flipping through the pages, he noticed the handwriting was jagged, as though written in a rush. The journal's entries spanned years, each one detailing the life of a solitary lighthouse keeper. Most of the entries were mundane: weather reports, maintenance logs, observations of the surrounding forest. But as he read on, the tone shifted, becoming more frantic and fragmented. The light must never go out. If it fails, the tide will come. The hunter frowned, reading the line again. The next entries grew darker. The keeper spoke of sleepless nights, strange noises in the forest, and figures he glimpsed at the tree line. He described the tide, not as water but as something alive, an overwhelming force that consumed everything in its path. The tide is patient. It waits for the light to fail. If you are reading this, you must understand, the light is our only defense. The entry stopped abruptly, the last page smeared with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The hunter closed the journal, his pulse quickening. The air inside the lighthouse seemed heavier now, as though the walls themselves pressed inward. He moved to the shelves, searching for anything that might explain the journal's claims. Most of the items were unremarkable: rusted tools, empty lanterns, and scraps of rope. But on the lowest shelf, he found an odd object, a small crystalline disc etched with the same swirling symbol from the journal's cover. He pocketed it and glanced back at the staircase. He hadn't seen or heard anything unusual outside, but the journal's words clung to him like a warning. Whatever the tide was, the thought of it made his skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his rifle and began ascending the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the eerie hum of the rotating light grew louder. The spiral staircase creaked under the hunter's weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence of the lighthouse. The air grew colder as he ascended, and the faint hum of the rotating light above seemed to vibrate through the walls. He tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. Halfway up, he paused at a small landing where the walls were etched with crude, swirling symbols. They matched the one on the journal's cover and the crystal disc he'd pocketed. The carvings were uneven and deep, as if they'd been scratched in haste or desperation. Some of the grooves were stained a dark, rust-like color. The hunter pressed on, the light above casting faint, sweeping beams that illuminated the narrow staircase intermittently. He finally reached the top, emerging into a circular room encased by the lighthouse's glass dome. The massive lens and its machinery sat at the center, rotating methodically. The light was dimmer up close, flickering slightly, as if struggling to maintain its rhythm. Setting his rifle down, he took out the journal again and flipped through its pages. There was something he might have missed, some explanation for what he'd seen. His pulse quickened as he reread certain lines. The light's power wanes. I've done all I can to keep it alive, but the tide is relentless. It waits for weakness, for the moment the forest goes dark. I can hear them now, just outside the tree line, watching, waiting. The hunter set the journal down on a nearby table, its words sinking into him like lead. He turned to inspect the light's machinery, which looked ancient and worn. Gears ground against one another with an unpleasant screech, and the bulb's faint glow seemed to waver more with every rotation. Then he noticed the windows. From this height, he had a clear view of the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The trees swayed in the faint breeze, their shadows shifting unnaturally under the rotating light. The forest's edge seemed to pulse, as if alive, with faint movements just beyond the reach of his vision. He squinted, leaning closer to the glass. At first it seemed like shadows cast by the trees, but then he realized they were moving independently, shifting, writhing, as though something hidden was circling the lighthouse. A chill ran down his spine. The journal's final entry echoed in his mind. If the light fails, they will come. Do not let the light fail. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But the rational part of his mind resisted. If the journal's warnings were true and the evidence before him was hard to ignore, then running wouldn't help. Whatever the tide was, it would find him in the darkness. The flickering light brought him back to the present. He grabbed his rifle and revolver, ensuring both were loaded. Then he returned to the machinery. It was clear the mechanism was failing, its parts grinding with every rotation. Without repairs, the light wouldn't last the night. The hunter cursed under his breath. He had no tools, no knowledge of how to fix a lighthouse's machinery. But he wasn't about to sit idly and wait for the tide to come. If the light failed, he'd be ready. Below him the forest seemed to stir, the faint howls of something inhuman reaching his ears. The hunter crouched near the lighthouse's failing machinery, his pulse thudding in his ears. The dim light flickered and faltered with each rotation, casting intermittent beams across the forest below. Each flicker made the shadows dance in unnatural ways, their movements almost purposeful. A sound broke the oppressive silence, a low, guttural howl that seemed to roll through the trees like a ripple on water. It was distant, yet it carried an unnatural resonance, like something vast and hollow was calling out. The hunter froze, his breath catching. His instincts told him this was no ordinary predator. He moved to the windows, scanning the forest below. The tree line, once a static sea of green and brown, now seemed alive with movement. Shapes darted between the trunks, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. The hunter couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was shifting, as though something beneath the surface was waking. Then came another sound, a series of sharp cracks like tree branches snapping under immense pressure. He tightened his grip on his rifle and scanned the forest's edge through the scope. At first he saw nothing, but then his gaze landed on a spot where the trees seemed to bend unnaturally. Something was moving through them, large enough to disturb the canopy. It wasn't visible, not entirely, but its presence was unmistakable. The hunter stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. He didn't need the journal to tell him that whatever was out there wasn't friendly. The light was his only defense, and it was failing. The mechanical hum of the rotating lamp grew uneven, accompanied by the screech of grinding gears. He turned his attention back to the machinery, searching for any way to stabilize it. The system was ancient, with exposed gears and rusted levers. He tried turning one of the levers, but it barely moved, frozen by years of neglect. The flickering light dimmed further, and a new sound reached his ears, a low, wet, slithering noise that sent a shiver down his spine. It came from the forest, growing louder with each passing moment. Whatever was out there was getting closer. Suddenly, a thud echoed from the base of the lighthouse, followed by a second, louder one. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal pawing at the door. It was deliberate, heavy, and unyielding. Something or someone was trying to get in. The hunter raised his rifle, aiming at the staircase leading down. His mind raced, weighing his options. If the light went out completely, he'd lose what little protection the lighthouse seemed to provide. But if he didn't address whatever was at the door, it might make its way inside. The thudding stopped, replaced by silence. The hunter held his breath, listening intently. Then a scraping sound echoed from the door like claws raking against the wood. He backed away, keeping the rifle trained on the staircase. The scraping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the only sound was the uneven hum of the light above. Then came a final sound, faint but chilling, a deep guttural exhale, as if something massive had just breathed against the door. The hunter's resolve hardened. He didn't know what was out there, but he wasn't about to let it catch him off guard. Rifle in hand, he positioned himself near the staircase, ready for whatever might come. The hunter stood motionless at the top of the staircase, the faint glow of the flickering light illuminating his tense frame. The lighthouse groaned as the wind picked up outside, but it wasn't the storm that unnerved him. It was the silence below. Whatever had scraped the door and let out that guttural breath was no longer making a sound, and that absence was more unsettling than the noise had been. He peered down the spiraling staircase, his rifle aimed, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The journal's words echoed in his mind. "The light is your only defense. If it fails, the tide will come." The light above emitted a strained hum, then a series of sputtering sounds. He turned his gaze upward just in time to see the beam falter and dim significantly. A grinding screech of metal against metal signaled the machinery's imminent failure. "Damn it," he muttered. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped back to inspect the machinery. He tried to turn a corroded gear, but it refused to budge. His fingers found a metal crank, partially hidden beneath layers of grime and rust. He grabbed it and pulled with all his strength, gritting his teeth as the crank resisted. Finally it gave way, turning with a reluctant groan. The light flickered, momentarily brightening, but the reprieve was short-lived. A loud clang echoed through the chamber as a crucial piece of the mechanism snapped off entirely. "No, no, no," he hissed, searching the floor for the broken piece. The light faltered again, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment the only sound was his own ragged breathing. Then it began, the howls. They came from every direction, long and guttural, reverberating through the forest like a chorus of predators converging on their prey. The sound was unearthly, a mix of animalistic growls and something more profound, more ancient. The hunter hurried to a window, peering out into the pitch-black forest. The shapes he'd glimpsed earlier were now fully visible, their forms illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. They were twisted, grotesque things, half-formed shadows with elongated limbs and gaping, featureless faces. They moved with unnatural fluidity, their bodies shifting and contorting as they crept closer to the lighthouse. And then came the tide. It started as a faint ripple, the ground at the forest's edge undulating as though it were liquid. The motion spread rapidly, the earth transforming into a writhing mass of black tendrils and shifting forms. The tendrils moved like waves, surging forward with a predatory grace, consuming everything in their path. Trees, rocks, and underbrush were swallowed whole, leaving nothing but a barren, shifting void in their wake. The hunter stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding. The tide was alive, just as the journal had warned. It wasn't water, it was something far worse. A living, predatory force intent on devouring anything in its path. He unslung his rifle, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. His mind raced, calculating his next move. The lighthouse was his only shelter, but without the light, it was little more than a temporary barricade. If the tide reached the structure, it wouldn't hold for long. The howls outside grew louder, accompanied by the sickening sound of the tide consuming the forest. The hunter braced himself, his finger on the trigger, as the first of the shadowy figures reached the lighthouse's base. The tide had come and there was no turning back. The hunter's pulse thundered in his ears as the shadowy figures reached the lighthouse's base. The scraping and thudding from before returned, but this time it was relentless. Multiple entities clawed and pounded against the wooden door, their strength rattling the entire structure. He glanced out of a window, watching in horror as the forest tide surged closer. It wasn't just a mass of tendrils and shadows. It was a writhing, sentient force. Faces formed within the tide, only to dissolve into the blackness moments later. Hands, elongated and malformed, reached out from the mass, grasping at nothing, then retreating into the chaos. The ground around the tide warped and buckled as if the forest itself was being devoured and reshaped by whatever this thing was. The hunter's instincts screamed at him to act. He aimed his rifle at the staircase, anticipating that the creatures clawing at the door might soon force their way in. The revolver on his hip was a comforting weight, but he knew ammunition alone wouldn't be enough to stop what was outside. A sudden deafening crash shook the lighthouse, and he knew the door had given way. Heavy, uneven footsteps ascended the staircase, accompanied by guttural growls and the wet, slithering sound he had heard earlier. He tightened his grip on his rifle, aiming down the staircase. The first creature came into view, its form barely humanoid. It moved with a jerky, unsettling gait, its elongated limbs contorting in unnatural ways. Its face was a blank expanse of shadow, but where its eyes should have been, faint points of pale light glimmered. It emitted a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the air, making his teeth ache. The hunter didn't hesitate. He fired a shot, the crack of the rifle echoing through the lighthouse. The bullet hit the creature square in the chest, and it stumbled backward with a distorted howl. But instead of falling, the wound began to close, black tendrils knitting the flesh back together. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Another creature appeared, then another, their grotesque forms filling the staircase. He fired again, this time aiming for the head. The second creature let out a shriek and collapsed, its body dissolving into an oily puddle that seeped into the cracks of the stone stairs. Encouraged, the hunter reloaded quickly, his movements precise and practiced. He fired at the others, aiming for their heads and watching as they disintegrated one by one. But for every creature he killed, another seemed to take its place, emerging from the tide outside. A loud groan echoed through the lighthouse as the structure itself seemed to shudder under the tide's relentless assault. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, a grim reminder that the lighthouse's defenses were crumbling. He needed to find a way to stop the tide before it consumed everything. Then he remembered the journal. The keeper had hinted at something stored in the lighthouse, something connected to the light that could repel the tide. He grabbed the journal from the table, flipping through its pages with shaking hands. The crystal is the key. Place it in the chamber and the light will return. But be warned, it demands a price. The hunter's hand went to his pocket, where the crystalline disc he had found earlier rested. He didn't know what price the journal referred to, but he wasn't about to let the tide consume him without a fight. The tide surged closer, its tendrils licking at the base of the lighthouse as the creatures continued their relentless advance. The hunter had one chance to reignite the light, or die trying. The hunter held the crystalline disc tightly, its smooth surface cold against his palm. The journal's warning echoed in his mind. The crystal is the key. Place it in the chamber and the light will return. But be warned, it demands a price. He glanced at the tide, now consuming the lower levels of the lighthouse. The walls groaned as the structure struggled to hold against the relentless, writhing force. Shadows poured in through the shattered doorway, creeping upward like a living flood. He had no time to weigh the consequences. Gripping his rifle in one hand and the crystal in the other, he bolted toward the lighthouse's central light chamber. The room was dominated by the massive lens and its intricate machinery, now dark and motionless. He scanned the area, his eyes landing on a small recess at the base of the machinery. The recess was circular, etched with the same swirling symbol as the crystal. "This better work," he muttered. The first of the shadow creatures reached the top of the staircase, its elongated limbs scraping against the walls. It let out a bone-chilling screech and lunged toward him. Without hesitation, the hunter swung his rifle up and fired, the shot blasting the creature's head apart. It dissolved into a black puddle, but another emerged from the shadows, followed by two more. He fired again, aiming with deadly precision. Each creature he struck dissolved into oily darkness, but their numbers kept growing. They moved faster now, their howls blending with the tide's oppressive roar. The hunter backed toward the light chamber, slamming a fresh clip into his rifle. He fired twice more, buying himself precious seconds. Then he turned and jammed the crystal into the recess. For a moment, nothing happened. Panic clawed at his chest as he frantically searched the journal's entries for another clue. The machinery remained lifeless, and the creatures were closing in, their shadowy forms slithering across the walls and floor. Then the crystal began to glow. A low hum emanated from the light chamber, growing in intensity until it filled the room. The crystal pulsed with a brilliant white light that flowed into the machinery, illuminating the intricate gears and lenses. The hunter stepped back as the chamber roared to life, the light growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The first beam shot outward, slicing through the darkness. The effect was immediate. The shadow creatures shrieked in unison, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the light touched them. The tide outside recoiled, its writhing mass shrinking away from the lighthouse as if burned. The ground beneath it ceased to ripple, the forest slowly regaining its natural stillness. The hunter shielded his eyes as the light filled the room, its intensity almost too much to bear. The air vibrated with energy, a soundless hum that resonated deep in his bones. He could feel the power of the crystal, ancient and otherworldly, surging through the lighthouse. But then came the pain. It started as a sharp, searing sensation in his chest, spreading rapidly through his body. He doubled over, gasping for breath, as the light seemed to pull something from within him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt as though he were being torn apart. The journal's warning rang clear in his mind. It demands a price. Whatever the crystal was, it was taking its toll, but the hunter refused to let go. Clutching the rifle tightly, he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand. The light was his only hope, and he wasn't about to let the tide win. As the shadows dissolved and the tide receded, the hunter's vision darkened. He felt the strength draining from his body, but he couldn't stop now. The light had to stay on. The hunter staggered against the wall of the light chamber, his body racked with pain as the crystal continued to glow. Its light filled the room with an almost holy radiance. driving the shadow creatures back and forcing the tide to retreat. He could feel the toll it was taking on him, a deep, gnawing sensation in his chest, as if the crystal were feeding on his very essence. Outside, the forest transformed under the power of the light. The writhing tide that had consumed the trees began to dissolve, its tendrils retreating into the shadows. The howls of the creatures faded into silence, replaced by the natural sounds of the forest slowly returning. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the gentle whisper of the wind. The hunter dropped to one knee, gasping for breath. His rifle clattered to the floor beside him, his grip too weak to hold it. He clenched his fists, trying to focus through the overwhelming sensation of being drained. The crystal pulsed again, its light growing brighter with each beat, but the pain in his chest intensified. He glanced down and froze. His hands were trembling, the veins beneath his skin glowing faintly with the same light as the crystal. Whatever power he had unleashed, it wasn't just affecting the lighthouse, it was affecting him. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the strange warmth radiating from within. "I'm not dying here," he growled through gritted teeth, forcing himself to his feet. The machinery roared to life again, the gears grinding and spinning as the light above began to rotate once more. The beams swept out over the forest, cutting through the remaining shadows. The hunter steadied himself against the wall, watching as the tide was pushed farther and farther away, retreating into the depths of the forest. But the light didn't stop. Instead of settling into its usual rhythm, the beam grew faster, brighter, and more erratic. The crystal's glow intensified, the swirling patterns within it spinning faster and faster. The lighthouse shook, its walls groaning under the strain of the unleashed energy. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the entire structure trembled. "Come on," the hunter muttered, his voice hoarse. "Hold together." He grabbed the journal from the table and flipped through its pages, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. One entry caught his eye. "The light is not just a defense, it is a barrier, a seal. If it falters, they will come. If it burns too brightly, it will draw them in." His stomach dropped. The light wasn't just pushing the tide away, it was calling something else. He looked out of the window, his heart sinking, as he saw the forest begin to stir again. The shadows at the edge of the retreating tide began to move, coalescing into something larger, darker, and far more menacing than the tide itself. The ground trembled as an enormous shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was a towering mass of shadow and tendrils, its form shifting constantly as it moved. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened across its surface, glowing with a sickly yellow light. The tide had been bad enough, but this was worse. The hunter grabbed his rifle, his muscles screaming in protest. The light might have saved him from the tide, but now it had drawn something far more dangerous to the lighthouse. He had to figure out how to stop it, and fast. The hunter gritted his teeth and steadied himself against the trembling walls of the lighthouse. The light had saved him from the tide, but it had also awakened something worse, something massive and ancient. The monstrous shape outside moved with an unnatural grace, its tendrils flowing like smoke as it approached. Its glowing eyes locked onto the lighthouse, each one radiating malice. The journal had warned about this, but the hunter hadn't fully understood. Now, with the creature advancing and the crystal's light blazing out of control, the stakes were clear. The light wasn't just a defense, it was a beacon, and something had answered its call. He tore his gaze from the window and focused on the crystal. The swirling energy inside it was spinning faster than ever, the glow nearly blinding. The lighthouse's machinery strained under the pressure, emitting a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. The walls groaned, cracks forming in the stone as the structure struggled to contain the power unleashed. "Think," he muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "There has to be a way to stop this." The journal's final warning echoed in his mind. The crystal demands a price. He glanced down at his hands, still trembling and faintly glowing. The light was draining him, using his life force to fuel its power. If he kept this up, it wouldn't just destroy the creature, it would destroy him too. A deafening roar shattered his thoughts, and he spun toward the window. The creature was nearly at the lighthouse now, its massive form towering over the trees. Tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the structure's base. The entire lighthouse shook, tilting slightly as the creature began to pull. The hunter's instincts took over. He aimed his rifle at one of the tendrils and fired, the shot echoing in the confined space. The bullet struck true, but the creature barely flinched. The tendril recoiled slightly, then lashed out again, slamming into the side of the lighthouse with enough force to crack the stone. Desperate, he grabbed the revolver from his hip and unloaded the chamber into the creature's glowing eyes. Each shot elicited a guttural roar, and the tendrils momentarily withdrew, but the reprieve was short-lived. The creature surged forward, its massive form pressing against the lighthouse. The hunter stumbled back as the walls buckled under the strain. The light from the crystal pulsed erratically, the energy threatening to explode outward. He didn't have much time. If he couldn't stop the creature, the entire lighthouse and everything around it would be destroyed. He flipped through the journal's pages again, searching for anything he might have missed. One entry stood out, scrawled hastily near the end. If the light burns too brightly, it must be dimmed. Remove the crystal, and the seal will hold, but do not break it. Breaking the crystal will unleash something far worse. The hunter's stomach twisted. Removing the crystal might stop the light, but it would leave him defenseless against the creature. Breaking it, though, wasn't an option. He glanced at the writhing mass outside, then at the glowing crystal. He had to make a decision, and fast. With the revolver still in one hand, he reached for the crystal. The instant his fingers touched it, searing pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and held on. The light intensified, bathing the room in an otherworldly glow. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, its tendrils slamming into the lighthouse with renewed fury. The hunter could feel the walls giving way, but he didn't let go. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he pulled the crystal from its recess. The light immediately dimmed, the oppressive energy dissipating. The creature froze, its massive form shuddering as if in confusion. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then, with a final furious roar, the creature retreated, its tendrils withdrawing into the darkness. The hunter collapsed to the floor, clutching the crystal tightly. The light was out, but the lighthouse still stood, and he was still alive. The silence that followed was deafening. The hunter lay sprawled on the cold floor of the lighthouse, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. The crystal in his hand no longer glowed. It was dark, cold, and lifeless, its swirling patterns frozen. The oppressive energy that had filled the room moments ago was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. He pushed himself up, his body protesting with every movement. The lighthouse's machinery had fallen silent, and the faint moonlight filtering through the windows was the only illumination now. He glanced out of the nearest window, his breath catching as he saw the forest below. The tide had vanished. Where the writhing mass of tendrils had consumed the forest floor, there was now nothing but barren earth. The trees nearest the lighthouse had been stripped of their leaves and bark, their skeletal forms standing stark against the night sky. Beyond them, the forest seemed normal, as though the tide had never existed. The hunter slung his rifle over his shoulder and descended the spiral staircase cautiously. The ground floor was in ruins, the door completely destroyed and the walls splintered where the creature's tendrils had struck. But the shadows were gone. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The air felt different, lighter, almost clean. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the creature watching him. But there was nothing. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the remaining trees. He looked back at the lighthouse, its towering form now dark and lifeless. The journal's warnings had been true. The light was the only thing holding the tide at bay, and now that it was out, he wasn't sure what would come next. He examined the dark crystal in his hand, its once vivid patterns now dull. He wasn't sure if it had been permanently drained or if it could be reactivated, but he wasn't willing to find out. With a grim expression, he placed it back in his pocket and started toward the tree line. Staying near the lighthouse felt like inviting disaster. The walk back through the forest was long and uneventful, though his senses remained on high alert. Every shadow, every movement of the trees set his heart racing, but the tide didn't return, and the oppressive stillness was gone. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. As he emerged from the trees, he turned back for one last look at the forest. The lighthouse was hidden now, swallowed by the dense canopy, but he could still feel its presence, a dark, looming weight at the back of his mind. He vowed never to return, no matter what. The hunter continued his journey, leaving the forest behind. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. At night, he dreamed of the tide, of its writhing tendrils and glowing eyes. Sometimes he swore he could hear faint howls in the distance, carried on the wind. The forest had let him go, but it hadn't forgotten him. It all started with a conversation over coffee with my friend, Marcus. We were talking about the usual things, work, life, and the occasional gossip, when he casually mentioned the dark web. I had heard about it before, but it was always in the context of illegal activities and shady dealings. Marcus, however, painted a picture that was both intriguing and terrifying. He told me about forums where hackers gathered, marketplaces selling everything from fake documents to illegal substances, and even rumors of websites offering services that defied logic and morality. As someone who fancied myself a bit of a tech enthusiast, I was curious. How hard could it be to access the dark web? Marcus told me to be careful, though, warning me about the dangers of venturing into such a shadowy part of the internet. His warnings only fueled my curiosity more. That evening, after we parted ways, I found myself unable to stop thinking about it. The unknown was calling to me, and I was eager to explore it. I started with a simple Google search: how to access the dark web. Hundreds of results popped up, ranging from step-by-step guides to horror stories of people who had encountered unspeakable things. After reading a few articles, I learned that I needed a special browser called Tor, which could anonymize my browsing and help me access .onion sites, the hidden gems of the dark web. Setting up Tor was surprisingly easy. Within minutes, I had downloaded the browser and was ready to dive in. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and apprehension as I launched Tor for the first time. The homepage was unremarkable, just a plain search bar, but I knew that behind this simple interface lay a labyrinth of secrets. My first few searches were tentative: dark web forums, deep web marketplaces, hidden services. I clicked on a few links, finding myself in poorly designed websites that looked like they hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Most of them were boring, filled with generic discussions about hacking and security. But I kept digging, clicking on link after link, letting my curiosity guide me deeper into the abyss. The more I explored, the more I realized how vast and unnerving the dark web could be. There were forums discussing things that made my skin crawl, places where people traded stolen data, and sites that hinted at services far more sinister than I could have imagined. It was like peering into a different world, one that operated in the shadows of our everyday lives. Hours passed like minutes as I navigated through this digital underworld. I was about to call it a night when I stumbled upon a link that caught my eye. The description was cryptic, something about unlocking human potential. My curiosity piqued. I clicked on it, unaware that this decision would lead me down a path I could never have anticipated. The website was stark, with a minimalist design and a single headline: "Clone yourself." At first I thought it was a joke or some kind of scam. But as I read through the site, my skepticism turned to a mix of awe and horror. They claimed to have developed technology to create human clones using nothing more than a small DNA sample. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but the site was detailed, with testimonials and supposed scientific explanations. I should have closed the browser then and there, but I was too intrigued. The idea was preposterous, yet the site was so convincing. Could it be real? Could they actually create a clone of me? The implications were mind-boggling, and I couldn't help but imagine the possibilities and the dangers. Little did I know, the deeper I delved into this bizarre website, the more I would discover about myself, leading to a revelation that would blur the lines between reality and nightmare. But that's a story for another part. For now, I was just a curious explorer, about to unearth a secret that would change everything. The website had a professional veneer, its sleek design and technical jargon lending it an unsettling credibility. Each page I clicked through was filled with detailed descriptions of the cloning process, diagrams of DNA extraction, and testimonials from supposed clients. The more I read, the more it seemed like something straight out of a dystopian novel. But here it was, laid out in clinical detail, promising to duplicate a person down to their very essence. I was mesmerized. The site claimed that with just a small DNA sample, a few strands of hair, a bit of saliva, they could create a fully grown human clone in a matter of months. They explained how the clone would be identical in every way: appearance, voice, even mannerisms. It was as if they had tapped into the very essence of what makes us unique. My curiosity soon turned to unease. As fascinating as the concept was, the potential for abuse was terrifying. What if someone cloned a person for nefarious purposes? What if these clones were used to commit crimes or replace individuals without anyone knowing? The implications were mind-boggling. After hours of reading and exploring, I found myself on a page that offered to show examples of their work. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Did I really want to see this? The site required a small fee to access this section, and against my better judgment, I paid it, eager to see what lay beyond. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The page loaded with images of people, all smiling innocently at the camera. They looked like ordinary profile pictures, but there was something unsettling about them. As I scrolled through, a sense of familiarity washed over me. These weren't just random people. They looked eerily similar to public figures and celebrities, albeit with slight differences that made them distinguishable. My breath caught in my throat as I continued to scroll. And then I saw it. An image that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was me. Not someone who looked like me, but me. Same dark hair, same hazel eyes, same small scar above my eyebrow from a childhood accident. It was as if I were staring into a mirror. I clicked on the image, my hands trembling. The profile details were identical to mine. Name, age, height, everything. How was this possible? I hadn't submitted any DNA sample. I hadn't even known about this site until a few hours ago. Yet here was a clone of me, staring back from the screen with a smile that suddenly seemed sinister. Panic set in. Who had done this, and why? My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each more disturbing than the last. Had someone taken my DNA without my knowledge? What were they planning to do with my clone? The idea of another version of me walking around was terrifying. What if this clone committed a crime? I'd be the one held responsible. My life could be ruined by actions I didn't commit. I spent the next few hours obsessively reading through the site's terms and conditions, looking for any clues that could explain what was happening. But the more I read, the less sense it made. Everything seemed legitimate, as if this were just another business offering a unique service. But I knew better. There was something deeply wrong here, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. As the first light of dawn began to filter through my window, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just ignore this. The implications were too severe. I took screenshots of everything: my clone's profile, the site's claims, anything that could serve as evidence. I needed to prove that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination, that there was a real threat here. My next step was clear. I had to report this to the authorities, to make them understand the danger this technology posed. But as I prepared to do so, a gnawing doubt began to creep in. Would they believe me? Or would they dismiss me as just another paranoid internet user lost in the depths of the dark web? One thing was certain: I was in way over my head, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty and fear. But I had no choice. I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image of myself staring back at me. How had this happened? My thoughts were a whirlwind of questions without answers. I decided to dive deeper into the website, desperate to find any clue that could explain how my clone ended up there. I scrolled through the site's directories, examining every detail with meticulous care. The more I looked, the more it felt like I was part of a twisted science fiction story. Each click revealed more profiles, more people who might not even know they had clones walking around. It was both fascinating and horrifying. Eventually, I stumbled upon a section of the site that detailed the cloning process in greater depth. It mentioned various methods of obtaining DNA samples, hair strands, used tissues, even discarded chewing gum. The realization hit me hard. It was entirely possible that someone had collected my DNA without my knowledge. A hair left on a brush, a tissue thrown away. It didn't take much. I began to retrace my steps, thinking back to recent weeks. Had I been anywhere unusual? Had I noticed anyone acting strangely around me? Nothing stood out. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could something so bizarre happen so quietly, without leaving any trace? Determined to find answers, I decided to contact the website directly. I composed an email, carefully wording it to sound as professional and calm as possible, despite the panic bubbling inside me. I asked how they had obtained my DNA and why there was a clone of me on their site. I didn't expect a reply, but it was worth a shot. To my surprise, I received a response the next day. The email was short and cryptic. Your inquiry has been forwarded to the appropriate department. We assure you that all our activities comply with legal and ethical standards. Further information will be provided in due course. Legal and ethical standards? The words felt hollow. There was nothing ethical about cloning someone without their consent. I knew I needed to take this further, but I was also afraid. What if this was bigger than I could handle? What if digging too deep put me in danger? Despite my fear, I pressed on. I decided to gather more information about the site itself. Using a few tricks I'd learned from tech forums, I tried to trace the website's origins. It was no easy task. The site was meticulously hidden behind layers of encryption and anonymity. Whoever was running this operation knew what they were doing. I managed to find snippets of information suggesting the site was hosted on servers scattered across several countries, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint its exact location. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like I was dealing with something far beyond a simple cloning service. This was an operation with serious resources and a disturbing agenda. Then came the moment that turned my unease into outright terror. As I was sifting through the site's code, I found a hidden directory. It was filled with surveillance footage, videos of people going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched. And there I was, in several of the clips, captured in places I thought were private. My home, my office, even my favorite coffee shop. The implications were chilling. Someone had been following me, monitoring my every move. They had taken my DNA and used it to create a clone, all without me ever knowing. But for what purpose? The possibilities were too terrifying to contemplate. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to report it to the authorities, no matter how crazy it sounded. But as I prepared my evidence, a new fear took hold. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was just another paranoid conspiracy theorist? I could see it now, the skeptical looks, the dismissive comments, but I had to try. This was too important to ignore. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, I gathered all my evidence and headed to the police station. As I walked through the doors, I felt like I was crossing a point of no return. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey into a darkness I could never have imagined. Walking into the police station felt surreal. Every step echoed the weight of my fear and uncertainty. I approached the front desk, my evidence clutched tightly in my hand, and told the officer on duty that I needed to report something urgent. The skepticism in his eyes was clear, but he led me to a small, stuffy room where I waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a detective entered. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, a man with a weary look, that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of bizarre cases. I laid out my story, detailing everything from my initial curiosity about the dark web to the discovery of my clone and the surveillance footage. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism turning into mild interest. When I showed him the screenshots and the surveillance clips, he frowned and took a deep breath. "This is unusual," he admitted, his tone carefully neutral. "We'll need to investigate further." He took my evidence, promising to look into it, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. As I left the station, a sense of helplessness settled over me. What if they dismissed this as a prank? What if nothing came of it? The days that followed were filled with anxiety. I kept expecting a phone call from the police, but none came. My paranoia grew. I started noticing people watching me, or at least I thought they were. Every stranger's glance seemed suspicious. Every casual encounter felt like a potential threat. Then one evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I began to consider the horrifying implications of my discovery. If there was a clone of me out there, what was it doing? Who controlled it? The idea of another version of myself, living and potentially acting out in ways I couldn't control, was terrifying. I thought about the scenarios. What if my clone committed a crime? Would the police come for me? Could I prove my innocence? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how vulnerable I was. The existence of my clone put everything I had at risk: my job, my relationships, my very identity. The thought kept me up at night. I imagined my clone being used for all sorts of nefarious purposes. What if it was used to commit fraud or worse? The idea of being held responsible for actions I didn't commit was unbearable. The paranoia grew to the point where I could hardly function. Every noise outside my window, every unfamiliar face felt like a potential threat. Desperate for answers, I turned to Reddit. I created a throwaway account and posted my story on several forums, hoping someone might have experienced something similar or could offer advice. The responses were a mixed bag. Some people dismissed it as a wild conspiracy theory, while others shared their own dark web horror stories, adding to my unease. One comment stood out. A user claiming to be a former dark web investigator messaged me privately. He told me that cloning technology, while advanced, wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. He explained that there were indeed groups experimenting with human cloning, often for illegal and unethical purposes. He warned me to be careful, to document everything, and to trust no one. The message left me even more rattled. If this user was right, then I was in more danger than I realized. I followed his advice, keeping a meticulous record of every strange occurrence and every piece of evidence I had, but I still felt alone and exposed. In the midst of all this, I received a call from Detective Harris. He sounded tired, almost apologetic. "We've looked into your case," he said slowly. "But there's not much we can do without more concrete evidence. It's a complex situation, and honestly, it's beyond our usual scope." I felt a mix of frustration and despair. The police weren't going to help. I was on my own. Returning to Reddit, I asked the community what I should do next. The responses varied, but a common theme emerged. I needed to protect myself. I had to be vigilant, stay off the grid as much as possible, and avoid any situations where my clone could be used against me. The reality was sinking in. My life had changed irrevocably. I was living in a state of constant vigilance, my every move shadowed by the knowledge that somewhere out there, another version of me existed. A version that could ruin my life with a single action. As I closed my laptop, the weight of my situation pressed down on me. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. The darkness of the web had reached out and pulled me into a nightmare, from which there was no easy escape. The days turned into weeks, and my life became a constant exercise in paranoia. Every time I saw someone who looked vaguely familiar, my heart would race. I couldn't shake the feeling that my clone was out there, living a parallel life, and that any moment my world could come crashing down. One evening, while obsessively checking my messages on Reddit, I noticed a new private message from the former dark web investigator who had initially reached out to me. He had some new information. "Listen," his message began. "I've been digging around since you posted your story. I found some chatter in dark web forums about a project matching your description. It's called Project Doppelganger. It's a clandestine operation, rumored to be run by a consortium of biohackers and rogue scientists. They're cloning people, yes, but what's more disturbing is their motive. They're creating these clones to replace individuals in high-stakes scenarios, crimes, espionage, even assassinations. Your clone might not be an accident. You could be a target for something much bigger." The message sent shivers down my spine. If this was true, my clone wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a weapon, and I was in the crosshairs of something far beyond my control. I knew I had to take drastic measures. First, I quit my job. It was too risky to continue in my current role, knowing that any slip-up by my clone could ruin my professional reputation. Then, I moved out of my apartment, staying with friends and family, never in one place for too long. I tried to erase my digital footprint as much as possible, using cash for transactions and avoiding any activities that required my identification. Despite these precautions, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped a beat, fearing it was another piece of bad news. I stopped talking to most of my friends, not wanting to drag them into my nightmare. My life had become a solitary existence dominated by fear and uncertainty. One day, a news headline caught my eye. "Unidentified man commits armed robbery. Suspect still at large." The grainy surveillance photo accompanying the article made my blood run cold. The man in the photo looked exactly like me. It was happening. My worst fear had come true. My clone had committed a crime, and it was only a matter of time before the police came knocking on my door. I called Detective Harris in a panic, but his response was as expected, skeptical and dismissive. "Look, we've got real crimes to solve," he said curtly. "Unless you have concrete evidence linking you to this, there's not much we can do." I felt utterly helpless. With the police unwilling to help, I turned once again to Reddit, updating the community on the latest development. The responses were mixed. Some still thought it was an elaborate prank, while others shared condolences and advice. The former investigator messaged me again, urging me to lay low for a while, suggesting it was probably just a prank but advising caution nonetheless. Taking his advice to heart, I decided to disappear for a bit. I moved to a small town, far away from my previous life. It was a place where nobody knew me, and I could blend into the background. The town was quiet, almost quaint, and it offered a strange sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. I rented a modest house and kept to myself, using a fake name and avoiding unnecessary contact with others. My days were spent in solitude, reading books, taking long walks, and trying to rebuild a semblance of normalcy. The constant fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. The months passed without incident. There were no more mysterious messages, no sightings of my clone, and no police knocking on my door. It seemed like the storm had finally passed. The message from the investigator might have been a prank, but it had served as a wake-up call, reminding me of the lengths I needed to go to protect myself. I'll never be the same person I was before all this began. The dark web had shown me a reality I never knew existed, one where technology could be twisted for terrifying purposes. I lost my job, my sense of security, and many of my friendships. But I survived. To anyone reading this, consider it a cautionary tale. The internet, especially its darkest corners, is full of secrets that can change your life forever. Be careful what you seek out, because you might just find it, and it might be more than you ever wanted to know. I'm 22 years old, still in college, and like most people my age, I often find myself with way too much time on my hands. Between studying for exams, hanging out with friends, and binge-watching Netflix, I get bored easily. You know how it is. You start looking for something new to entertain yourself. That's how I ended up discovering the dark web. It all started on a rainy Tuesday night. I was sitting in my tiny dorm room, staring at my laptop, feeling utterly uninspired. My roommate was out of town, and I had already watched all the latest episodes of my favorite shows. That's when I remembered a conversation I overheard at a party about the dark web. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to give it a try. I had heard about the dark web before, of course. It's where all the hidden parts of the internet lie. A place where you can find anything from illegal stuff to black market dangerous stuff. But my interest wasn't in buying anything illegal. I was just looking for something different, something thrilling. A quick Google search showed me how to download Tor, the browser that allows you to access the dark web anonymously. With a few clicks, it was installed on my laptop, and I was ready to dive in. The first few websites I visited were pretty mundane, just forums discussing various topics that you wouldn't usually find on the surface web. But then, as I continued to click through links, I stumbled upon a site with a black background and red text that caught my eye. The title was simple but ominous: The Path to Enlightenment. I should have stopped there. I should have closed my laptop and gone to bed. But something about that title drew me in. I clicked the link, and it brought me to a page filled with bizarre images and texts. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The homepage had a picture of a goat's head, and the text was in some ancient language I couldn't understand. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. After all, it was just a website, right? I scrolled down and saw more disturbing images. Inverted crosses, pentagrams, and grotesque drawings that looked like they were straight out of a nightmare. There were also links to various rituals and ceremonies. I didn't dare click on those. Even in my state of bored curiosity, I had my limits. Then I noticed a link to a chat room. It was labeled Followers of the Dark One. By this point, I was already too deep. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The chat room was filled with people discussing things I couldn't even begin to comprehend. They talked about their devotion to Satan, sharing details of rituals they had performed. It was all very surreal and more than a little disturbing. I was about to leave when I saw someone post a link with the caption, "Join us if you dare." Without thinking, I clicked on it. The new page that opened was even more sinister than the last. It had videos of people performing rituals, chanting in languages that sounded ancient and evil. There were more images too, some of which I can't even describe. Let's just say they were the stuff of nightmares. I knew I should stop. I knew I should close my laptop and pretend none of this ever happened. But I was hooked. It was like watching a horror movie, except this was real. I spent hours on that site, going deeper and deeper into the twisted world of these satanic followers. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. After that first night, I couldn't get the images and words from the site out of my head. I tried to focus on my studies and hang out with friends, but every free moment I found myself drawn back to the dark web. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I needed to see more to understand what I had stumbled upon. So a few nights later, I fired up my laptop, opened Tor, and navigated back to The Path to Enlightenment. This time I was determined to explore it more thoroughly. I clicked on the rituals section, even though a part of me was screaming not to. The descriptions were detailed, describing steps to summon dark forces and other horrifying acts. I won't get into the details because, honestly, I wish I could forget them. What struck me was how seriously these people took it. There were pictures of altars, candles, and symbols painted in what I hoped was just red paint. The forums were filled with discussions about the best ways to perform certain rituals, and people shared their experiences with an almost religious fervor. Some posts even had videos attached. I made the mistake of watching a few, but they were too graphic, too real. I stumbled upon a section dedicated to the devotees of Lucifer. It was a kind of hierarchy within the group, with members boasting about their level of devotion and the rituals they had completed. It was clear that these people weren't just playing around. They believed in this stuff with a passion that was terrifying. Then I found a link to another chat room, one that seemed even more secretive than the last. It required a password, and I had no idea how to get in. Just as I was about to give up, I received a private message from one of the members. It was a single line. "Do you seek the truth?" Along with the message was the password for the chat room. My heart pounded as I typed in the password and entered the chat room. The atmosphere here was different. It felt more intense, more serious. The conversations were darker, filled with references to sacrifices, summoning demons, and other things I didn't even want to understand. One user stood out to me. Their username was Dark Disciple, and they seemed to be a leader or a high-ranking member. They talked about an upcoming event and how it was crucial for the followers to participate. I watched as the chat room buzzed with excitement and anticipation. I was too scared to type anything, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, Dark Disciple posted something that made my blood run cold. "We need a new initiate for the ceremony. Someone pure, someone unsuspecting." There was a flurry of activity as members volunteered names and suggested people they knew. I wanted to leave, to shut down my computer and never return. But I was frozen. Just as I was about to force myself to close the browser, I received another private message. It was from Dark Disciple. "Welcome, new initiate. We know who you are." My heart stopped. How could they know anything about me? I hadn't given any personal information. Panic surged through me as I typed back, "What do you mean?" The reply came almost instantly. "We have been watching. We know everything." Before I could react, another message popped up. This one contained my full name, my address, and even a picture of me sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop. I felt a wave of nausea. How the hell did they get this information? I hadn't told anyone about my dark web excursions. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I had opened a door to something I couldn't close. The reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some creepy website. These people were serious, and they had their sights set on me. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down. Maybe it was a bluff, I told myself. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They had too much information, too much detail. I was in over my head, and I had no idea how to get out. Little did I know, my nightmare was just beginning. For the next few days, I was on edge. Every time my phone buzzed or I heard a knock on my dorm room door, my heart would race. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I tried to go about my normal routine, but the thought of those people knowing so much about me was terrifying. Despite my fear, I couldn't stay away from my laptop. I needed to know more, to understand how they found me, and what they wanted. So, one night, against my better judgment, I opened Tor again. This time I was careful. I used a VPN, checked my laptop for any malware, and made sure all my personal information was hidden. I was determined to be more cautious. I logged back into the chat room with a fake username, trying to blend in and not attract attention. The conversations were just as dark and disturbing as before, filled with discussions about rituals and ceremonies. I was reading through the messages when Dark Disciple posted another announcement. "The ceremony is in 3 days. We have our initiate. Prepare yourselves." My stomach churned. I knew they were talking about me. I needed to know more about this ceremony, what they were planning, and how I could stop it. I clicked on Dark Disciple's profile and saw an option to send a private message. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I tried to decide what to do. I took a deep breath and typed, "What do you want from me?" I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, a reply came. "You have been chosen. Your blood will seal our pact with the Dark One." I felt sick. This was worse than I had imagined. They didn't just want to scare me, they wanted to use me in some kind of ritual. I needed to get out of this, but I didn't know how. I typed back, trying to keep my fear in check. "I don't want any part of this. Leave me alone." The reply was immediate and chilling. "It's too late. We are everywhere." I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in my dorm. I had to get out, find a safe place where they couldn't reach me. I packed a bag with some essentials and left, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away from there. I ended up at a friend's apartment, too scared to tell them the full story. I just said I needed a place to crash for a few days. The next morning, as I walked to a nearby coffee shop, I noticed something strange. There were people I didn't recognize hanging around my dorm building. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces partially hidden by hoods. My heart skipped a beat. Were they watching me? I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Everywhere I went, I saw them, standing on street corners, sitting in cafes, always watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront them, find out what they wanted, and make it stop. That evening, as I left my friend's apartment, I saw one of them standing by the entrance. Summoning all my courage, I walked up to him. He was tall, with a gaunt face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. He didn't respond at first, just stared at me with that unsettling gaze. Then he spoke in a low, almost hypnotic voice. "We need your blood for the ritual. You have been chosen." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why me? What did I do?" He smiled, a cold, eerie smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You opened the door. Now it cannot be closed." Before I could react, he reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me closer. I struggled, but his grip was strong. He pulled out a small, sharp knife and pressed it against my skin. "We only need a drop," he said, his voice calm and steady. Panic surged through me. I had to get away. Summoning all my strength, I kicked him in the shin and yanked my arm free. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I was sure I had lost him. I was out of breath and terrified, but I had managed to escape. This was getting out of hand. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to get far away, someplace where they couldn't find me. There was only one place I could think of: home. My family lived in Scotland, and I knew I'd be safe there. I booked a flight for the next morning, praying that I could make it through the night without any more encounters. Little did I know the nightmare was far from over. That night was the longest of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing. I barely slept, my mind filled with images of hooded figures and sharp knives. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the window, I grabbed my bag and headed to the airport. The flight to Scotland was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of them on the plane. When I finally landed, I felt a wave of relief. I was home, far away from the nightmare I had left behind. My parents were surprised to see me, of course, but I told them I just needed a break from school and that I missed them. For the first few days, things seemed normal. I helped my mom around the house, went for long walks in the countryside, and tried to forget about everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. That sense of being watched never really went away. One evening, as I was walking home from the village pub, I saw them. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, dressed in dark robes. I thought it was my imagination, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. They had found me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure followed, maintaining a steady distance. When I reached my house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I peeked through the curtains and saw more of them gathering at the edge of our property, their dark forms barely visible in the fading light. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell my parents. When I explained everything, they were understandably shocked and terrified. My dad called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figures had disappeared. The police assured us they would patrol the area, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. The next few days were tense. My parents tried to keep things normal, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Every night I stayed up late, watching from my bedroom window. The figures returned each night, just standing there watching. They never came closer, but their presence was a constant reminder that I wasn't safe. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront them again. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, and against my parents' protests, I walked out to the edge of our property. The figures were there, as always. I shone the flashlight on them, and they didn't flinch. "Why are you here?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" One of them stepped forward. It was the same man who had confronted me in America, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. "You know why we're here," he said in that same low, chilling voice. "We need your blood for the ritual." I tightened my grip on the knife. "I won't let you take it," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave me alone." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You can't escape us. We are everywhere. The ritual must be completed." I took a step back, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this. Suddenly, I remembered something I had read on their website about breaking the pact. It was a long shot, but I had to try. "What if I can offer something else?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What if I can find another way to complete the ritual without my blood?" He paused, considering my words. "There is only one way," he said finally, "but it requires a great sacrifice. Are you willing to do whatever it takes?" I nodded, not really knowing what I was agreeing to. "Yes, just tell me what to do." He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming in the flashlight's beam. "Meet us at the old church at midnight. Bring the Book of Shadows. Only then will we consider your offer." With that, he turned and walked away, the other figures following silently. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. What had I gotten myself into? Back inside, I told my parents everything. They were scared but supportive. My dad remembered an old book he had inherited from his grandfather, a dusty old tome filled with strange symbols and incantations. It had always creeped me out as a kid, but now it seemed like my only hope. Midnight couldn't come fast enough. With the Book of Shadows in hand, I headed to the old church, my parents insisting on coming with me. When we arrived, the figures were already there, their dark forms barely visible in the moonlight. I approached them, holding out the book. "This is what you want, right?" The leader nodded. "It's a start. Now follow our instructions carefully. One mistake, and it's over." What followed was the most terrifying experience of my life. They had me read incantations, draw symbols with chalk, and light candles in a specific order. The air grew thick with a strange, oppressive energy, and I could feel the darkness closing in around us. Finally, it was done. The leader stepped forward and took the book from my hands. "You have fulfilled your part of the bargain. The ritual is complete." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "So it's over? You'll leave me alone now?" He nodded. "For now. But remember, we are always watching. One misstep, and we will return." With that, they disappeared into the night, leaving us standing in the empty churchyard. I collapsed into my parents' arms, exhausted and terrified, but relieved that for the moment the nightmare was over. As we walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. They might leave me alone for now, but I knew they would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to return. But for now, I was safe, and that was all that mattered. For the next few weeks, things seemed to settle down. The hooded figures disappeared, and life began to return to normal. My parents were relieved, and I tried to focus on my studies and reconnecting with old friends. But the experience had changed me. I was constantly on edge, jumping at shadows and second-guessing every stranger I saw. Despite the calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching and waiting. I spent a lot of time reading the Book of Shadows, trying to understand more about what I had been dealing with. It was filled with ancient rituals, dark magic, and cryptic warnings. It gave me some insight, but it also left me with more questions. One night, as I was reading through the book, I found a section about protective spells and wards. It described how to create barriers that could keep dark forces at bay. I decided to give it a try. I gathered the necessary ingredients, salt, candles, and a few herbs, and followed the instructions to the letter. I drew symbols around the house and said the incantations, hoping that it would be enough to keep the darkness away. For a while it seemed to work. I started to feel more at ease, and the nightmares that had plagued me since the encounter began to fade. My parents noticed the change and were supportive, though they didn't fully understand what I had been through. Then, one evening, just as I was starting to believe that the worst was behind me, there was a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late, and we weren't expecting anyone. My dad went to answer it, and I followed, my stomach in knots. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just a small black envelope lying on the doormat. My dad picked it up and handed it to me, his expression puzzled. I opened it with trembling hands and pulled out a single piece of paper. Written in blood-red ink were the words, "You cannot escape your fate." Panic surged through me. They had found me again. I showed the note to my parents, and we all knew what it meant. We couldn't stay here. I had put my family in danger by coming back, and now we had to leave. We packed our bags that night, deciding to go stay with relatives in a different part of Scotland. We needed to stay one step ahead of them. The next few months were a whirlwind. We moved from place to place, never staying too long in one spot. My parents helped me change my name and appearance, hoping to make it harder for them to track me. It was exhausting, living in constant fear and uncertainty, but it was the only way to stay safe. During this time, I continued to study the Book of Shadows, learning more about the dark forces that hunted me. I found ways to protect myself and my family, using wards and protective spells to keep them at bay. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave us some peace of mind. Eventually, we settled in a small, remote village where we hoped they wouldn't find us. Life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. I enrolled in a new college under my new identity, and my parents started a small business to keep us afloat. But the fear never completely left me. I knew that as long as they were out there, I could never truly be safe. I continued to keep a low profile, avoiding any activity that might draw attention. I made new friends, but I never told them about my past. It was a burden I had to bear alone. One night as I was walking home from class, I felt a familiar sense of unease. I turned around and saw a figure in the distance, dressed in dark robes. My heart raced, but I kept walking, refusing to let fear control me. I knew what to do now. I had learned how to protect myself and my loved ones. When I got home, I immediately went to my room and performed the protective rituals I had memorized. I drew the symbols, said the incantations, and felt the comforting presence of the ward surrounding me. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that this was my life now. I would always have to be vigilant, always have to protect myself. But I was no longer the scared college student who had stumbled into the dark web out of boredom. I was stronger now, more prepared. I had faced the darkness and survived. I knew that they might come for me again, but I was ready. I would keep fighting, keep protecting myself and my family. The path I had chosen was a dangerous one, but it was mine, and I would walk it with my head held high, no matter what came next. I never imagined a late-night hangout with my buddy Luca would turn into a living nightmare. It all started innocently enough, with the usual pizza, soda, and endless banter about video games and our favorite horror movies. But that night, things took a bizarre turn. Luca had always been the adventurous type, always looking for the next thrill. He suggested we explore the dark web, something I had only heard about in hushed whispers and cautionary tales. "Come on, man, it's just for fun," he said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "We'll use a VPN and Tor. It's totally safe." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We downloaded a VPN first, ensuring our IP addresses would be masked. Luca explained that this would make us virtually untraceable. It felt like we were stepping into a shadowy, hidden world, far removed from our everyday lives. Once the VPN was up and running, we downloaded Tor, the browser designed for accessing the deep web. The dark web, Luca explained, was a subset of the deep web, filled with all sorts of hidden sites. The idea of exploring something so secretive was thrilling, but also incredibly unsettling. We spent the next hour or so browsing random forums and marketplaces. Most of it was mundane: pirated software, fake documents, and dubious pharmaceuticals. But then, Luca stumbled upon a site that made my skin crawl. It was a forum dedicated to services that could be hired anonymously. Among the various offerings, one stood out: professional stalking services. "Check this out," Luca said, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. The site's description was both vague and ominous, promising to deliver an unforgettable experience for the right price. "This is insane," I said, laughing nervously. "Who would even want something like that?" Luca shrugged, his eyes still glued to the screen. "It's just a joke, man. Imagine the look on someone's face if they found out they were being stalked. Classic prank." I shook my head, uneasy but curious. "Yeah, but it's not like we know anyone who would fall for it." Luca grinned, and that's when I should have known something was up. "What about you?" he asked, a playful tone in his voice. "You haven't been hanging out with us much since you started dating Emily. Consider it payback." I laughed it off, thinking he was just messing with me. But Luca was serious. He navigated through the site, clicking on various links until he found the purchase page. The cost was steep, payable only in Bitcoin. "You're crazy," I said, still chuckling. "You're not actually going to do this." "Watch me," Luca replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He created an account, transferred some Bitcoin, and placed the order. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. "There," he said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. "You're officially being stalked. Happy now?" I didn't know whether to laugh or be genuinely worried. The whole thing seemed too surreal to be taken seriously. After all, it was just a website on the dark web, probably run by scammers. Little did I know, this was the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. We spent the rest of the night joking about it, making light of the situation. But deep down I felt a knot of unease. The dark web was no joke, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. As I left Luca's place and headed home, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be there. It was all supposed to be a harmless prank, just a bit of fun to spice up our mundane lives. But as the days went by, I would come to realize just how wrong we were. A few days passed since Luca's so-called prank. Life went on as usual, or so it seemed. Emily and I continued to see each other, and I was busy with work and other commitments. I had almost forgotten about the dark web escapade until Luca called me one evening. "Hey, man," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Can you come over? I need to show you something." Curiosity got the better of me, so I drove to Luca's place. He greeted me at the door with a somber expression, a stark contrast to his usual carefree demeanor. "What's up?" I asked, stepping inside. Luca led me to his computer, already set up with the Tor browser open. "Remember that stalking service I told you about?" he said. "Well, I went through with it." I stared at him, confused. Yeah, I remember. I thought you were just joking. I wasn't, he replied, pulling up the transaction history. Look. There it was, in black and white. A Bitcoin transaction for an absurd amount of money. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was real. Luca had actually paid someone to stalk me. Why would you do this? I asked, anger and fear mingling in my voice. Luca shrugged, looking a bit sheepish. You haven't been hanging out with us much since you started dating Emily. It was supposed to be a joke, like payback or something. I didn't think it would actually work. I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. This isn't funny, Luca. This is serious. He nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. I know, man. I didn't think it through. But nothing's happened yet, right? Maybe it's just a scam. I wanted to believe him. The idea that someone could actually be stalking me was too terrifying to consider, but the transaction was real, and the implications were starting to sink in. What did the website say about the service? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Luca pulled up the site again, scrolling through the eerie, minimalist design. It just says they'll start the stalking within a week of the payment. They don't give any details about who or how. A week. That meant any day now, someone could start following me, watching my every move. The thought made my skin crawl. Look, if anything weird happens, you need to tell me, Luca said, trying to reassure me. We'll figure this out together. I nodded, still in a daze. Yeah, okay, but seriously, don't do anything like this again. Luca agreed, and I left his place with a heavy heart. The drive home felt longer than usual, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I knew it was probably just paranoia. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Every time I saw a stranger on the street or noticed a car following me for more than a few blocks, my heart would race. I told myself it was all in my head, that there was no way Luca's prank could actually result in someone stalking me. But then Luca called me again, and this time his voice was filled with panic. Dude, you need to come over now, he said, barely able to keep his composure. Something's happened. I rushed to his place, my mind spinning with possibilities. When I arrived, Luca was pacing back and forth, clutching his phone. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my own panic at bay. Luca handed me his phone, showing me a series of messages from an anonymous number. They were filled with chilling details about my daily routine, where I worked, what time I left the house, even the route I took to Emily's place. How do they know all this? I stammered, feeling my blood run cold. I don't know, Luca said, looking genuinely terrified. But this is real, man. I don't know what to do. Neither did I. The prank had gone horribly wrong, and now we were in way over our heads. The dark web was no longer just a curiosity. It was a very real threat, and the worst part was we had no idea who was behind it or what they wanted. As I left Luca's place that night, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The world suddenly seemed a lot more dangerous, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. The nightmare had begun, and there was no waking up from it. The following days were a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left the house, I scanned the streets, looking for anything or anyone out of place. Emily noticed my jumpiness, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I explain that my best friend had hired a stalker as a joke, and now things were spiraling out of control? For the first few days after Luca showed me the messages, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I started to think maybe it was all a sick prank, that someone on the dark web was just messing with us. But then, things took a turn for the worse. It was a Wednesday, and I had just finished a late shift at work. As I walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to dispel the paranoia. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a message from Luca. "Have you noticed anything weird?" it read. I sighed and replied, "Just my imagination running wild. Why?" His response was immediate. "Just stay alert, okay? I have a bad feeling about this." I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next day was uneventful, and I started to convince myself that maybe the stalker had lost interest. But that evening, everything changed. I was on my way to Emily's place for dinner. It was already dark when I noticed a figure standing at the end of my street. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was someone in a clown costume. The garish makeup and wild, colorful hair were unmistakable, even from a distance. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had always found clowns creepy, but this was on another level. The figure just stood there, motionless, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, maybe some kids messing around. But as I drove past, the clown turned its head slowly to follow my car with its gaze. I arrived at Emily's house, my heart still pounding. She greeted me with a warm smile, but I couldn't bring myself to return it fully. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the clown to appear. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, concern in her eyes. "Nothing. Just a long day at work," I lied, forcing a smile. Dinner was tense. I was too distracted to enjoy the meal or the conversation. When it was time to leave, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I said goodbye to Emily, promising to call her when I got home safely. As I drove back, I kept checking my rear-view mirror. When I turned onto my street, my heart nearly stopped. The clown was there, standing in the exact same spot as before. This time it was holding a balloon, and I could see a sinister grin painted on its face. I parked my car in the driveway, my hands trembling. I didn't want to get out, but I couldn't just sit there all night. Gathering my courage, I made a dash for the front door, fumbling with my keys in my haste. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I called Luca, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened. He was silent for a moment before saying, "We need to go to the police." Reluctantly, I agreed. The next morning, we went to the local police station and explained everything. The officer we spoke to listened patiently, but I could tell he was skeptical. "So let me get this straight," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Your friend hired a stalker off the dark web, and now you're being followed by someone in a clown costume?" I nodded, feeling ridiculous. "Yes, that's exactly what's happening," the officer sighed. "Look, we'll keep an eye out, but there's not much we can do without more concrete evidence. Just stay vigilant and report anything suspicious." We left the station feeling deflated. The police hadn't taken us seriously, and now we were on our own. That night, I double-checked all the locks and windows before going to bed. Sleep did not come easily. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs. The living room window was shattered, and the clown was standing in the middle of the room, shards of glass crunching under its oversized shoes. Panic took over, and I bolted out the back door, not stopping until I was several blocks away. I called Luca, my voice frantic. "The clown, it's in my house. I don't know what to do." "Get out of there and call the police again," he said, sounding just as scared as I was. I followed his advice, and soon my street was swarming with police. But by the time they arrived, the clown was gone, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and a lingering sense of dread. This was no longer a joke. It was real, and it was terrifying, and I had no idea how to make it stop. The night the clown broke into my house was a turning point. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with Luca, who was equally shaken by the events. We spent the night talking, trying to make sense of what was happening. "We need a plan," Luca said, pacing the small living room of his apartment. "We can't just sit around and wait for this to get worse." "I know," I replied, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. "But what can we do? The police didn't take us seriously, and this clown, it's like something out of a nightmare." Luca nodded, his face pale. "I've been thinking, maybe we need to hire someone, a private investigator, or even look for help online." The irony wasn't lost on me. We had gotten into this mess by venturing into the dark web, and now we were considering turning back to the internet for a solution. But what choice did we have? The police had been of little help, and I was desperate. We spent the next few days looking for any leads we could find. Luca reached out to a private investigator, but he required a hefty fee up front, which we couldn't afford. Meanwhile, I scoured forums and online communities, hoping to find someone who had dealt with something similar. Then, one evening, I stumbled upon a thread on a forum dedicated to dark web experiences. It was filled with horror stories, but one post caught my eye. A user described being stalked after hiring a service similar to the one Luca had found. The details were eerily similar to my own experience. I contacted the user, hoping they might have some advice. To my surprise, they responded quickly. They warned me that the dark web was unpredictable and dangerous, and once you engaged with it, there was no telling what might happen. "There's no easy way out," they wrote, "but if you can find out who's behind the stalking, you might be able to negotiate with them. They're in it for the money, after all." Negotiating with a stalker, or a killer clown, seemed like a long shot, but it was the only lead we had. Luca and I decided to dig deeper into the dark web, trying to trace the transaction and find any information about the person or group behind it. Late one night, as we delved into the depths of hidden forums and encrypted messages, Luca found something. A user profile linked to the stalking service had posted about delivering on a recent order and providing the best in horror experiences. The profile had a contact link leading to an encrypted messaging service. "This is it," Luca said, his voice tense. "We can reach out and try to get some answers." With trembling hands, I typed out a message, trying to sound calm and assertive. I explained that the stalking had gone too far, that we were willing to pay to make it stop. Then we waited. Hours passed with no response. Luca eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I couldn't rest. My mind was racing, filled with images of the clown and the shattered window. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, my phone buzzed. The response was brief. "Payment received. Stalking will cease. Do not contact again." I stared at the message, hardly daring to believe it. "Luca, wake up," I said, shaking him. "Look at this." He rubbed his eyes, then read the message. "Do you think it's over?" he asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. "I don't know," I replied. "But it's the first good news we've had in a while." The next few days were tense but uneventful. I returned to my house, cautiously optimistic that the nightmare was over. I fixed the broken window and tried to get back to my routine. Emily noticed a change in me, but I still couldn't bring myself to tell her the whole story. I just said things had been resolved, but the sense of relief was short-lived. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "Did you miss me?" My heart sank as I read the words. I rushed to the window and peered outside. There, under the streetlight, was the clown, holding a balloon and waving slowly. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The message from the stalker had been a lie. They had never intended to stop. And now, it seemed, they were enjoying the game more than ever. I called Luca, my voice trembling. "It's not over. The clown is back." Luca swore under his breath. "We need to go to the police again. This time we won't leave until they take us seriously." Desperation gave me the strength to agree. We drove to the police station in the dead of night, demanding to speak to someone in charge. This time, they listened. The presence of the clown, the broken window, the threatening messages. It was enough to get their attention. They assigned an officer to patrol my neighborhood and advised me to stay with someone for a while. I moved in with Luca, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. The police were involved now, but the clown was still out there, and I had no idea what their next move would be. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. The police patrols provided some comfort, but I knew they couldn't watch me all the time. I felt like a prisoner, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next encounter with the clown. Living with Luca provided some comfort, but the fear never really left. Every night I lay awake waiting for the clown to reappear. The police patrols in my neighborhood helped, but they couldn't watch me around the clock. Days turned into a week, and the tension grew unbearable. Then, one night, the nightmare reached its peak. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed. Luca was already up, his face pale with fear. "It's happening again," he whispered. We tiptoed towards the living room, the sound of crunching glass under our feet. The sight that greeted us froze my blood. The clown was inside Luca's apartment, its grotesque face illuminated by the dim light from the street lamp outside. It stood there, holding a long, wicked-looking knife in one hand and a balloon in the other. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I forced it down. We had to get out now. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Luca's arm. We bolted out the back door, not stopping until we were several blocks away. I dialed 911 with shaking hands, trying to explain what had happened. The operator assured me that officers were on their way. We hid in a nearby park, hearts racing, until we saw the flashing lights of police cars. The officers swept through Luca's apartment, but by the time they arrived, the clown was gone, leaving behind only destruction and a twisted balloon animal. "This has to stop," I said, my voice breaking. "We can't keep living like this." The officers took our statements and promised to increase patrols in the area, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought we were dealing with a deranged prankster, not a genuine threat. Exhausted and terrified, we returned to Luca's apartment to find it a mess. The clown had left a note, scrawled in red ink, "Next time you won't be so lucky." That was the last straw. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't rely on the police or anyone else. I had to end this nightmare myself. I spent the next few days researching, diving deeper into the dark web, trying to find any clue about the identity of the clown. I contacted the user who had warned me before, desperate for any advice. They suggested trying to trace the Bitcoin transaction, but warned that it would be difficult and dangerous. With Luca's help, we managed to trace the transaction to a wallet linked to a notorious dark web marketplace. It was a slim lead, but it was all we had. We decided to confront the person behind the transaction. Using an anonymous account, we sent a message demanding that the stalking stop. We threatened to expose their operations if they didn't comply. It was a risky move, but we were out of options. For days, we heard nothing. Then, one evening, I received a response. "You've made a mistake. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street if you want this to end." It felt like a trap, but I had no choice. Luca insisted on coming with me, and we prepared as best we could, arming ourselves with whatever we could find. We arrived at the warehouse just after midnight, the air thick with tension. Inside, the place was dark and silent, except for the occasional creak of the old building settling. We moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, someone stepped into the beam of light. The clown. "Welcome," it said, its voice muffled by the mask. "I've been waiting for you." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "This ends now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The clown laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "You think you can just walk away? You've entered my world and there's no escape." Before I could react, the clown lunged at us. Luca and I fought back with everything we had, the struggle chaotic and desperate. In the chaos, I managed to knock the mask off, revealing the face beneath. It was a man, his eyes wild and filled with madness. We fought until the police, alerted by our earlier tip-off, stormed the warehouse. They tackled the man to the ground and he was finally in custody. Relief washed over me as the officers led the man away. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for weeks had finally come to an end. In the days that followed, I tried to piece my life back together. The police investigation revealed that the man was a hired stalker who had taken the job to a terrifying extreme. He had a history of mental illness and a fascination with clowns, which explained his disturbing choice of disguise. Luca and I made a pact to stay away from the dark web and anything remotely related to it. The experience had been a harsh lesson about the dangers lurking in the shadows of the internet. I moved back into my house, slowly regaining a sense of normalcy. Emily was a rock, helping me through the trauma and reminding me that I wasn't alone. One night, as we sat on the porch, I decided to share my story online. I wanted to warn others about the perils of the dark web, hoping that my experience could prevent someone else from making the same mistakes. So here it is. Stay away from the dark web. It's a place where nightmares are born, and once you step into that world, there's no telling what horrors you might unleash. Some things are better left in the shadows, and no thrill is worth the terror that can come from dabbling in the unknown. Stay safe, and never underestimate the dark web. I've always been fascinated by the unknown. Growing up, I was the kid who stayed up late reading ghost stories, watching horror movies, and diving into every creepy corner of the internet I could find. Naturally, it wasn't long before my curiosity led me to the darkest corners of the web, the infamous dark web. For those who might not know, the dark web is a part of the internet that's not indexed by search engines and requires special software to access. It's notorious for illegal activities, disturbing content, and the promise of hidden secrets. Stories of unimaginable horrors and mysteries always piqued my interest, but I never had the guts to actually explore it myself. That changed one quiet, boring weekend. After binge-watching a series of YouTube videos where people recounted their supposed dark web experiences, my curiosity got the best of me. The videos ranged from obviously fake to chillingly believable, and each one seemed to pull me deeper into a desire to see it for myself. So, against my better judgment, I decided to take the plunge. Setting up was easier than I expected. I downloaded Tor, the browser used to access the dark web, and a VPN to keep my identity hidden. I spent a good hour researching how to do it safely, making sure I wouldn't leave any digital traces that could lead back to me. Every guide I read hammered home the same point. Be careful and don't click on anything suspicious. With my heart pounding in my chest, I launched Tor and took my first step into the unknown. Navigating the dark web was underwhelming at first. I hopped from link to link, landing on pages that were either blank, filled with nonsensical text, or just plain boring. There were plenty of forums, marketplaces, and directories, but nothing caught my interest. The anonymity of it all felt eerie, like walking through an abandoned city at night. But apart from the occasional unsettling image or bizarre post, it seemed pretty mundane. After about an hour of fruitless browsing, I started to get frustrated. Maybe all those stories were just exaggerated. Maybe the dark web wasn't the treasure trove of horror and mystery I had imagined. I was just about to call it a night when I stumbled upon a link that piqued my curiosity. It was simply labeled charity listings. Now I know what you're thinking. Charity listings? On the dark web? It didn't make sense to me either, but I was bored and it seemed harmless enough. Besides, I figured it would be a funny anecdote to tell my friends later. I clicked the link, and a plain text page loaded with a list of charitable organizations. There was nothing sinister about it, just names of various charities and a brief description of each. Disappointed, I closed the browser and shut down my computer. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, but I reassured myself that the dark web was just a bunch of overhyped nonsense and drifted off to sleep, not knowing the real nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling a bit foolish about my adventure into the dark web. It was one of those things that seemed thrilling in the moment, but ridiculous in the light of day. I decided to forget about it and move on. After all, nothing bad had happened, right? As I sat down at my desk to start my day, I noticed something odd on my computer screen. A new file had appeared on my desktop overnight. It was simply named Readme TXT. My initial thought was that maybe I had accidentally downloaded it while browsing the previous night. The file size was tiny, just a few kilobytes, and I figured it couldn't be anything harmful. Curiosity got the best of me again, and I decided to open it. The file contained a simple text message. Here are the charities you might find interesting. Below the message was a list of charitable organizations, similar to what I had seen on the website. I felt a bit relieved. It seemed like a harmless reminder of my fruitless search on the dark web. Still, something about it felt off. I hadn't intentionally downloaded anything, and the fact that it had appeared without my knowledge was unsettling. I shrugged it off, reasoning that maybe I had clicked something without realizing it. I deleted the file and went about my day. Over the next few days, things started to get strange. My computer was acting up in ways it never had before. Programs were running slower, and occasionally my screen would freeze for no apparent reason. I ran a full virus scan, but nothing turned up. It was frustrating, but I chalked it up to my aging hardware and figured I was due for an upgrade soon anyway. Then one evening, I noticed something even more bizarre. My webcam's light flickered on for a split second and then went off. My heart skipped a beat. I had heard stories about hackers gaining access to webcams, but I never imagined it could happen to me. I immediately put a piece of tape over the camera and ran another virus scan, but again, nothing came up. Paranoia started to creep in. Every little glitch, every minor slowdown, made me wonder if I had been compromised. I began to regret my foray into the dark web. What if I had opened a door I couldn't close? What if something, or someone, had followed me back? My concerns reached a peak when I received a strange email. It was from an unknown address and contained only a single line. I hope you enjoyed the charities. Attached to the email was another text file. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting to see some kind of threat or demand. Instead, it was just another list of charities, but this time with links to their websites. Despite the seemingly benign nature of the message, it sent chills down my spine. I knew now that I was being watched, and whoever was behind this was toying with me. I deleted the email and the file, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling of being violated, of having my privacy ripped away from me. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, constantly checking my computer for signs of tampering. I even considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I had downloaded Tor and now someone was sending me lists of charities. As much as I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, the fear gnawed at me, and deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The real horror was yet to come. Despite the growing unease, I tried to carry on with my daily routine. I rationalized that maybe, just maybe, the strange occurrences were mere coincidences. But as much as I wanted to believe that, I couldn't ignore the creeping dread that something more sinister was at play. A week later, I decided to investigate the charity list email more thoroughly. Perhaps there was something I had missed, some clue that could explain what was happening. I retrieved the email from my trash folder and opened the attached file again. At first glance, it was identical to the previous lists I had seen, a collection of charity names with corresponding links. But as I scrutinized the document, I noticed something peculiar. One of the charity names was slightly out of line with the rest, just a few pixels off. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. Intrigued, I highlighted the area and discovered an invisible hyperlink embedded in the text. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the link. Every instinct screamed at me not to click it, but my curiosity, that same curiosity that led me to the dark web in the first place, pushed me to proceed. I clicked the link. The screen flickered, and for a moment it seemed as though nothing had happened. Then, a new window popped up, displaying a seemingly random string of numbers and letters. It looked like a cryptic code, incomprehensible at first glance. I copied the text and ran a search online, hoping to find some explanation. After several minutes of digging, I found a forum where someone had posted a similar string, asking for help to decode it. The replies suggested it was a form of encryption used to hide information within benign-looking files. It dawned on me that this charity list was more than it appeared. The real content was hidden beneath layers of encryption, and I had inadvertently stumbled upon it. Feeling a mix of excitement and dread, I continued my investigation. With the help of some online tools, I managed to decode the string. What I found sent chills down my spine. The decrypted text revealed a list of my recent online activities, including websites I had visited, emails I had sent, and even private messages. It was clear that someone had been monitoring me closely. My heart raced as I realized the extent of the surveillance. I had been careful, or so I thought, but it was evident that my actions had been tracked from the moment I ventured into the dark web. The charity list had been a guise, a way to plant malware on my system and collect my data. Panicking, I disconnected my computer from the internet and ran another virus scan, this time using a more sophisticated tool. The results confirmed my worst fears. My system was indeed infected with spyware. The malware had embedded itself deep within my files, collecting information and sending it back to an unknown source. I spent the next few hours frantically trying to remove the malware. I followed every guide, every piece of advice I could find online, but it seemed like an endless battle. No matter what I did, traces of the infection remained, lurking in the background, watching my every move. The realization hit me hard. This was no longer a game or an adventure. I was in real danger, and my digital life had been compromised. But the worst part was yet to come. Little did I know, the consequences of my actions would soon manifest in ways I could never have imagined. I was living a nightmare. Days turned into a haze of paranoia and frantic attempts to secure my system. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was always a step ahead of me. My initial curiosity had morphed into a relentless fear that gripped me every waking moment. Then came the day that confirmed my worst fears. I logged into my bank account to transfer some money, only to be greeted by an empty balance. Every last cent had been drained. My stomach dropped and my hands started to shake. I double-checked, hoping it was a mistake, but the transactions were there, clear as day. Someone had siphoned off my funds in a series of small transfers over the past week, too subtle for me to notice until it was too late. Panic surged through me. I immediately called the bank, but the representative's tone was cautious. They promised to investigate, but they couldn't guarantee anything. They advised me to report the incident to the authorities, which only added to my growing anxiety. I knew this was the result of the malware I had inadvertently invited into my life. But it didn't stop at my bank account. As I checked my other online accounts, I found more signs of tampering. Unauthorized purchases on my credit cards, suspicious emails sent from my address, and even my social media accounts showed activity that wasn't mine. It felt like my entire digital identity was being stripped away, piece by piece. I decided it was time to come clean and contacted a cybersecurity expert. After explaining the situation, they agreed to take a look at my computer. When they arrived, they were grim. After a thorough examination, they confirmed that my system had been compromised by a sophisticated piece of malware, It had embedded itself deeply, capturing keystrokes, passwords, and other sensitive information. The expert explained that this kind of malware is often hidden in seemingly harmless files, just like the charity list I had opened. It could be controlled remotely, allowing the attacker to monitor my activities and extract information at will. They advised me to disconnect my computer permanently and consider getting a new one. The data breach was so severe that even a complete wipe might not guarantee safety. As I absorbed this information, my mind raced with the implications. Someone out there had access to everything: my financial details, personal conversations, and private data. The expert assured me they would help secure my digital life, but the damage was already done. The sense of violation was overwhelming. To make matters worse, a few days later, I received a package in the mail. It was an unmarked envelope containing printed copies of some of my private emails and personal photos. There was no note, no indication of who sent it, but the message was clear. I was completely exposed. The timing couldn't have been a coincidence. Whoever was behind this wanted me to know they were in control. I went to the police with all the evidence I had, but their response was disheartening. Cybercrime is notoriously difficult to trace, and the anonymity of the dark web only made it harder. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't hold out much hope. The sense of helplessness was crushing. Every day I lived in fear of what might come next. Would they empty my accounts again? Leak more sensitive information? Or worse, come after me physically? The stress was unbearable. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, trying to make sense of the chaos my life had become, a new email pinged on my phone. With a sense of dread, I opened it. The message was brief and chilling. "We are always watching." That was the breaking point. I realized that no matter how hard I tried to secure my digital life, I could never truly be safe. The dark web wasn't just a place of curiosity. It was a web that had ensnared me, and now I was paying the price for my reckless curiosity. In the days and weeks that followed, my life became a shell of what it once was. The fear of being watched, the constant anxiety about my information being used against me, and the never-ending stress of dealing with the fallout took a heavy toll on my mental and physical health. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, every knock at the door or unexpected phone call sending waves of panic through me. I worked tirelessly with cybersecurity experts to rebuild my digital life from the ground up. I bought a new computer, changed all my passwords, and implemented every possible security measure to protect myself. Despite these efforts, I could never fully shake the feeling that I was being monitored, that another attack could come at any moment. The police investigation yielded no results. The anonymity of the dark web made it impossible to trace the origins of the malware or identify the perpetrators. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the wreckage of my life. Looking back, I realized how naive and foolish I had been. My curiosity had led me down a dark path, and I had underestimated the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the internet. The thrill of exploring the unknown had blinded me to the very real risks, and now I was living with the consequences. I want to share my story not to scare you, but to warn you. The dark web is not a playground. It's a dangerous place where malevolent forces operate with impunity. You might think you're just browsing harmlessly, but every click, every download could be a trap waiting to ensnare you. So, if you ever feel the itch to explore the dark web, to see what secrets lie hidden in its depths, remember my story. Remember the sleepless nights, the empty bank accounts, the violated privacy. Remember that no matter how careful you think you are never truly safe. Stay away from the dark web. It's not worth the risk. No matter how intriguing the stories or how strong the curiosity, protect yourself and your digital life. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. If I could go back in time, I would never have downloaded Tor, never have clicked those links, and never have opened that seemingly harmless file. My life before that fateful night might have been mundane, but it was safe and secure. Now I live with a constant reminder of the dangers of unchecked curiosity. Please, learn from my mistake. Stay safe and always think twice before diving into the unknown. The dark web is a dark place for a reason, and not everyone who tries to mess around there comes back with no consequences.